I'm gonna start this video off with an extremely controversial opinion. Ninjago is a TV show. I know, absolutely gripping stuff I've got to tell you. But because it is a TV show, it suffers from something that everything suffers from. Errors. Because unfortunately, no piece of media is perfect. Everything you will watch, or everything you'll read, no matter what it is, it will have problems with it. But the thing is that I personally find it fascinating. And that is why this is going to be the part 2 to interesting Ninjago animation errors. Because if there's one thing I love, it is interesting mistakes when watching the show. Now, as I explained in the previous video, there are certain errors that I am not going to cover unless it's particularly fascinating. And that is mainly when a suit is different, or when something is just off for no particular reason. It's the ones that don't make a lot of sense is what gets my curiosity. And in the previous episode, we covered the pilot through to Rebooted, and today we are going to do season 4 through till season 7. So just like that, let's talk about Tournament of Elements. Now, season 4 is one of the most popular seasons to say the least, but for the most part it doesn't have a particular animation error that's quite crazy or iconic. But there are still ones in there that I want to mention. So I do have 2 animation errors, and I do have 1 special mention, which doesn't fall into the category of an animation error, but it does fall under an interesting error to say the least. But the first error is not actually linked to a particular episode overall, but it is just one that falls under multiple episodes across the season. This being the tournament bracket that Chen uses to show who is fighting who, and this comes from the fact that if you look closely, Kai is actually incorrect. While all of the ninja are in their tournament outfit, Kai for some reason is constantly shown to be in his Rebooted outfit, and the explanation for it is completely unknown. Unofficially speaking, you could probably round it down to the fact that it was done as a placeholder before the ninjas tournament designs were finished, and they just simply forgot to update it when entering the actual stage of animation. But it still exists in every single episode that they did that featured Kai in the brackets. But it is just fascinating to say the least, because he is the only character on the bracket to have any sort of error, and it remains consistent throughout every single episode that we saw it. And that is why I wanted to bring it up, because it's something I simply can't unsee when rewatching season 4. The second animation error, however, does contain a spoiler for Dragon's Rising Season 2 Part 2. So this is your warning, and this is the time to go to if you don't want to hear it. So like that, 3, 2, 1. We have an error that recently did become an error because of Dragon's Rising Season 2 Part 2. And that is coming from Mr. Pale. In Season 4 Episode 7, we see Mr. Pale lose his elemental power. Now, in Season 2 Part 2 of Dragon's Rising, Mr. Pale also loses his elemental power. But the difference is that in Season 4, Mr. Pale still remains invisible, but in Dragon's Rising, we finally get to see his face. So which one actually is accurate? Now, personally speaking, I do stand by the mentality that most of the time, if something in newer media contradicts what it was before, it typically means that that is the new canon. So by definition, this makes Season 4 an animation error, and I think the involvement of Dragon's Rising is what makes this interesting, and that is why it's in the video. Hello all non-spoiler fans, welcome back, and we are going to go into the special mention for Season 4, and guess what it is? Not an animation error! At the end of Season 4, Episode 4, we get to see a scene where Cole finds Zane alive in the tunnels. And during this scene, we hear Zugu talk. The thing that makes this interesting is the fact that Zugu for some reason sounds like General Cryptor. And there is no explanation to why a robotic filter would be over his voice during this scene. Now, I have no explanation for this theory, and it's such an anomaly to me that I never realized until recent time, but now I simply cannot unhear it. And I want to know what you guys think is the cause of this. But it never really constituted as an animation error, so that is why it's a bonus for Season 4. But just like that, it's time for Possession. Now, for the most part, Possession is fairly airtight. It's actually quite impressive how there's not much in the way of animation errors during the season, but there are still animation errors nonetheless, and they are certainly interesting, to put it lightly. The first animation error is coming from Season 5 Episode 4, and this scene shows Nia fire an explosive at Moro in Moro's body. Now, the interesting thing about this scene is that the explosive itself is attached to the allied armor of Azure, and in reaction to the threat of death, Moro chucks the piece of armor off of him. Now, what makes this interesting is the fact that when Moro lifts the armor off of his torso, you will see the front of the armor remain in place and completely detached from the rest, and it will remain in front of Moro for the rest of that scene. Now, this again is particularly interesting to me, because similar to Rattler's eyes in the last episode, I think it's a bit weird that the allied armor was not a full model rig, instead looking like its individual pieces. And it's curious to know how they didn't see this during the animation stage. It really does just show you how individual pieces of a model can just magically separate, and it shows how much effort actually goes into each single frame to make sure everything remains in place, because clearly errors like this can happen anywhere. But it is just interesting to see stuff like this, because this animation error also then shows the possessed Moro torso in full form, and it is fascinating to see it in show when before now all we had was the actual minifigure itself. But I have no explanation as to how it could have happened outside of this. But none than that, it's still a great animation error to notice in particular. And one thing I like about this series is that it shows you these little interesting details while watching the show. But moving on to the next one, this one does come from the Cursed World 2-parter, and we have a scene where for some reason Jay and Kai are both in their pilot suits. Now, not in their entirety, which makes this very interesting. You will notice that both Kai and Jay only have the torso and the legs as their 2011 prints. The rest, however, is still the possession look, mainly the arms, the shoulder pads, and the hoods. Now, this again is very interesting to me, because why are the 2011 prints on the 2015 Ninja? And I do think it's a fascinating thing to look at, especially considering this isn't the only time it's happened. I am of course referring to Skybound, where we see Jay have the exact same animation error, but only on his legs. This does imply to me that it's clear that the animators use the pilot suits as the placeholder outfits when animating the show. Must be before they have any sort of designs in place for their suits. But every once in a while you'll see it slip through the cracks, and that leads to these amazing little animation errors. And it is one I love and one I simply can't miss now. But like I said, this is clearly the result of them having a placeholder before the deep stone suits were finished. And it is just fascinating to say the least, because it's interesting to know what suits they use as placeholders before the final product is made. Because like I said, they clearly do use placeholders, and this isn't the first time we see placeholders when it comes to the show or the sets, because if you look at placeholders for sets, you will notice that they do use certain minifigures in particular as the placeholder. But I could go on about this topic all day, so I'm going to move on to Skybound. Skybound is fairly interesting because while it doesn't have a lot of animation errors, it still has some fascinating ones to say the least. And I'm going to talk about two that I think are just a bit strange to say the least. In Season 6, Part 3, we see Zane and Kai try to get the bounty back from captivity in a yard. Now, the interesting thing is that the background shows the reappearance of something fairly interesting. In certain shots, if you look at the background, you will see Garmatron. What is it doing there? Now, by all accounts, the Garmatron machine became the tower that the Overlord uses at the end of Season 2. And in the end, it blows up. So what is the vehicle doing in a random salvage yard in the middle of nowhere? Who knows? Now, Tommy Andreasen was asked about this on Twitter, and he does somewhat imply that he didn't realise that it was there, but he makes a passing comment saying that Garmatron probably broke down. And that is quite funny to say the least. But in universe, how does it explain this? Now, it ultimately means one of two things. Garmatron didn't become the tower, and Wu was wrong at the end of Season 2, or it is simply not meant to be there, and one of the animators placed it there for an Easter egg. Now, I would like to make the prediction that it's probably not actually meant to be there, and it was a fun little Easter egg by one of the animators. But the point is, it's still there, and I'm going to acknowledge it, and I'm going to hate it. Ninjago is a terrible show. No, I'm joking, I love it. But no, all jokes aside, it is just an interesting little Easter egg, but by all accounts, it is technically an animation error, because it wasn't actually meant to be there. The second animation error from Skybound does in fact come from the episode A Wish and a Prayer, and this one I think is fairly funny. Earlier in this episode, we have Narukon tell Flintlock to remain in Ninjago while he goes to Tiger Widow Island to secure Jay. Now what makes this interesting is that towards the end of the episode, when Narukon is successful in his mission and does capture him, he goes into a sky shark to escape back to Ninjago. But who's piloting that ship? Flintlock! Now, who knows how this happened, and by all accounts, this could have happened without it being an animation error, but it leads to a very funny idea on how it came around, because Narukon did not want Flintlock to go with him. But there he is, he's just flying around, he's just looking around the cockpit as that scene goes on, and he's fairly prominent in the scene to say the least. So how did he end up there? Who knows, but it's extremely funny to say the least. But just like that, let's go to the Day of the Departed. Now, to put it simply, Day of the Departed has a lot of animation errors, and I think that's partly down to the fact that they weren't expecting to have to make something, because that was when the movie was originally going to release. But in the end, they had to make something, so they made the special. But there's a lot of issues, and I could point out a ton of them, but I don't really want to, so I only picked out one of them because I think it's the most interesting of the lot. There is a scene where Pythor and Cryptor have a remark about needing some extra help, and they mention the Hall of Sidekicks, and from then onwards, Samukai has some skeletons, Cryptor has some Nindroids, Chen has some cultists, they all just have some friends to say the least. But the thing about it is the fact that none of them share the ghostly glow of their former masters. Now again, this is extremely interesting, and we know it's an animation error because we know where they came from, and I doubt that they were real stone warriors and real skeletons just sitting around waiting on the event of Samukai or Kozu turning back up. So it's clearly an animation error. But it is fascinating, and I don't think there's any sort of explanation that can really give it away apart from the fact that it is just an animation error. And it's just interesting to know that people missed it when they were doing Day of the Departed. But it's still fascinating to say the least, and I think it's still fun to point out amongst the other errors from that special. But like that, let's get to the final season I'm going to cover today, because I am saving the next episode for the only trilogy, and then I'll go into the Wild Brain era. But for season 7, let's get started. Now, putting it simply, Hand of Time has a lot of animation errors. In the similar vein to Day of the Departed, it seems to be that this season just had a lot of weird issues. But weirdly, not a lot of major animation errors to say the least. It's a lot of missing eyebrows here, or wrong thing there. It's just a very, very large bunch of small errors, but it's interesting nonetheless. But the first one is going to be a fairly iconic one that I just want to talk about because I think it's funny, and that's from the episode The Line of Sand, where we have Jay going into the time bubble to rescue his friends, and amongst his friends is another Jay. And through Tommy Andreasen, we again know that for some reason, just no one on the animation team seemed to have caught it. And it's hilarious to say the least, because the scene does focus on Jay going into the time bubble with his bike. And to have another Jay just get through the cracks, it's just nothing short of hilarious. He actually takes the place of Cole in this scene, so that's why you'll see that there is no Cole for that one shot. And again, it's just funny, because it's such a harmless little animation error, and it's become somewhat iconic amongst Ninjago fans, so I feel like I had to mention it. But let's go to the next one. The last one comes from the episode The Attack, and to say the least, this episode probably holds the record for the most animation errors in a single episode, because this episode was seemingly put together by tape. But I'm not going to mention some of the more iconic ones, such as Nia missing her hair. I'm actually going to point out an interesting little animation error that I only became aware of recently, and I think it's hilarious to say at least. And that is that for a few scenes, Kai's katana is replaced by a vermilion sword. Now you can tell that it was clearly an animation error because if you look at the sword itself, it's very dulled down and it's not in any scene that has any sort of priority. But it is there for a couple of scenes and it's hilarious. How this happens, I don't know. But to be fair, the whole episode is just riddled with animation errors. It is very interesting to see how much got through the cracks, such as a sliding Kai, Lloyd missing his shoulder pad, and also having that shoulder pad clip through Wu. Crux and a Chronic switch positions like 20 times during this episode. It's just got so much going on with it. But it is certainly interesting to see such a small error like this happen, because while it is a small error, it's still fairly major to say that it got through 2 or 3 scenes, to put it lightly. But just like that, I have covered every animation error that I found interesting from season 4 through to season 7, and let me know if any of these you found interesting or if you never realized until now. If you were to ask me for my favorite animation error of the bunch, it would probably be the one with Flintlock, because I find it hilarious to think that Narukhan decided that Flintlock couldn't go along for the ride, and then later decided that he could. It presents the idea of a very funny conversation between Flintlock and Narukhan, where Flintlock would have had to have begged to have gone to the island, and eventually Narukhan would have relegated to flying him around. And I think that is just hilarious, to put it simply. But that is why it's probably my favourite of the bunch. But just like that, I have gone through all of the animation errors. And let me know if you are excited to see animation errors from the Oni trilogy. But just like that, thank you guys for watching. Take care, okay,